Thank you all for coming here on a beautiful day, but you've chosen to be here. We deeply appreciate that. My name is Jim Waller. I'm the acting director of the Gladstein Family Human Rights Institute here at UConn and a professor in the Department of Literature, Cultures, Languages, and Human Rights. I want to start with acknowledging that the land we're gathered together tonight is the territory of the Eastern Pequot, Golden Hill Pagusset, Lenape, Mashantucket Pequot, Mohegan, Nipmuc, and Schaghticoke peoples who stewarded this land through generations. As always, we thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land, and we aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. Again, we're thrilled that you've joined us today. If this is your first time at an HRI, Human Rights Institute event, welcome. We would love to see you at many more events. If you're a returning visitor, welcome. We're always glad to have you at these events. HRI has a very full calendar. You can find our events calendar on our homepage for the Gladstein Family Human Rights Institute. It's a calendar that's rich in programming. We have some incredible opportunities just in the past 10 days. I think it was a week ago today. We were in here with a program we've co-sponsored with the Women's Center here at UConn for Matika Wilbur, who is an indigenous photographer who spent years traveling the length and breadth of the country to take photographs of every single federally recognized Indian tribe. At that time, that was 562 tribes. Wonderful event. In the hallway outside of this auditorium, we've just put up this week an exhibit of Matika's photographs, which were wonderful. 2 nights ago, I was on the other side of campus being master of ceremonies for a jazz concert, which I didn't have on my bingo card when all of this started, but I was there because it was a concert that the UConn jazz faculty wanted to honor the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a list of 30 rights that everyone has simply for being alive. You don't have to apply for them. You don't have to file for them. You have them simply because you're alive. And our jazz faculty composed 7 different suites, all original compositions, with each of the suites focusing on a very specific article in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's the kind of quality and breadth of programming that we're very proud of at the Human Rights Institute. But what we're really, really proud of today is our inaugural Osiatyński lecture that's going to be delivered by Professor Shareen Hertel. So it is my great privilege to introduce a colleague, close friend, Dr. Kathy Lieball, who has served as the director of the Gladstein Family Human Rights Institute for over the past 10 years. And I have the pleasure of Kathy introducing our topic and our speaker tonight. Kathy.
Thank you, Jim. And it's really an honor to be here. Normally, I would keep my remarks very short. They're going to be just a little longer than usual because I want to explain the significance of this lecture and the endowed chair which Shareen Hertel has held for the last 3 years. And then I want to give Shareen her due because she's truly been one of the foundational members of HRI and helped create this community in a very substantive way. Many of the scientists who are sitting in this room who may have never come to the Conover before have come because Shareen has touched their lives so deeply. Alum who are here to honor her. And we have many alum and students and faculty and then people as far across the ocean as Poland also tuning in to hear Shareen's lecture. So it's a privilege to welcome you to this lecture which is dedicated to the memory of Wiktor Osiatyński, a distinguished legal scholar, sociologist, and a foundational figure in the Polish and global human rights movements. Human rights are under assault within our communities and across the country at an intensity which I think none of us expected. We might have imagined a bit, but it's perhaps exceeded even, my wildest imagination. And if Wiktor were here today, he would encourage us to find creative and impactful ways to enact our human rights close to home, in our communities, in our states like Connecticut, and in our broader society. So I want to say a few words about this person, Wiktor Osiatyński, someone I came to know over nearly 20 years because of his close relationships with faculty and students here at HRI. His career was defined by the transition of human rights from dissident theory into constitutional reality. Having witnessed the constraints of the post-war system in Poland, his involvement in the 1968 student demonstrations marked the beginning of a lifelong commitment to the rule of law. His impact was most visible during the disintegration of communism in 1989. As an advisor to constitutional committees, he co-authored the draft of Poland's Bill of Rights and authored several provisions of the 1997 Constitution. His work ensured that the social and political conditions for freedom were not merely aspirational, but legally codified. Beyond the law, Wiktor was a prolific scholar of over 20 books examining the intersection of constitutionalism, social thought, and human dignity, and his influence extended through his leadership at Central European University, the University of Chicago School of Law, and the Open Society Foundations. Beyond the law, here at the University of Connecticut, we remember him as a pivotal architect of our own Human Rights Institute. Since delivering the inaugural Gladstein Lecture in 2000, 3 years before the Institute was formed, he remained a constant presence. As a teacher and a board member, he reminded us that rights are the floor upon which we act, but that our true goal is to spring up toward the values that we cherish. And in his final years, Wiktor emphasized that human rights are indispensable for creating movements that transcend the law to engage people in the fight for a better world. We honor his legacy by means of the endowed professorship, which is a 3-year rotating chair, and Professor Shareen Hertel has been the first chairholder. So before introducing Shareen, I want to sincerely thank the HRI team, to thank Jim Waller, Rachel Jackson, Alex Branzel, Sage Montana, Jackie Thompson, and many others who've contributed to this evening's event, and to Vice President Daniel Wiener and the Office of Global Affairs for your unwavering support of HRI and the leadership you have shown over the many years. We wouldn't have the Osiatyński Chair would it not have been for your strong leadership in global affairs. We also express our appreciation to the donors who made the Osiatyński Endowed Chair in Human Rights possible. First to Gary and Phyllis Gladstein, Jeffrey Gladstein, and Mindy Grafstein, your enormous generosity has enabled the Institute to train a generation of human rights scholars and practitioners, as well as bring thousands of people through our doors who might not otherwise think about how human rights matter from local to global levels. Your generosity and what you've been so pivotal in helping us to build here at UConn matter now more than ever as we struggle to maintain a democracy. To George Soros and his family, as well as the Open Society Foundations, we're deeply grateful for the endowment that supports student scholarships. And one of these scholarships is in Wiktor Osiatyński's name. And we're also grateful for the gift that, when matched by the Gladsteins, allowed for the creation of the Osiatyński Chair. So as I mentioned, the chair rotates amongst faculty every 3 years, and the structure affords our faculty the time and resources to engage scholarly research and practice on human rights, on issues of equity and justice. It's fitting that this inaugural lecture is being given by one of the founding faculty members of our institute. Jointly appointed to the Department of Political Science and HRI in 2004, it just happened to be the same year I came, so we were kind of like sisters in cohort, right? Shareen has been a champion of bridging disciplinary divides in human rights through her longtime leadership of the research program on economic and social rights, to her path-breaking work with other colleagues in the School of Engineering to found the country's, and perhaps the world's, first program in engineering for human rights. Shareen is a stalwart defender of human rights, knitting together in her teaching, scholarship, and service an understanding of the interdependence of these rights, and especially of the importance of economic and social rights, with a particular focus on labor. And when Richard Wilson set out the job ad that ended up in hiring Shareen, he took a kind of bold move because he was pretty skeptical about this thing, economic and social rights, but he decided we're going to do something a little bit different at UConn, and we're going to hire a scholar in this field. And hence the search committee put forward Shareen as the successful candidate. So her writing is always accessible. She continually strives to make her work legible to non-expert audiences, which Wiktor deeply appreciated. Yet her scholarship was also very deeply empirical and rigorous in its theoretical contribution. In short, she's able to communicate with literally anyone, from the person sitting next to her on the plane, to a person that might be at the gym, to her neighbor, to students in her classroom, about the relevance of human rights. And she does this tirelessly. So in recognition of these qualities, she was awarded a 2026 Faculty Excellence and Mentorship Award for working with undergraduate researchers, a Provost Award for Excellence in Public Engagement in an earlier period, the Class Distinguished Teaching Award, the American Political Science Association Distinguished Human Rights Scholar Award, and my personal favorite, because it shows how broad her reach is at the university. In 2019, she was named the UConn baseball team's Most Valuable Professor Award. And I think that's fitting given the focus that we had in the recent summit on sports and human rights. So, and these are only a few of her distinctions. She's provided intensive and dedicated feedback to so many students on their research projects about their professional goals, and always with empathy, but also sometimes with the hard message that something needs to change. The many students and alumni here this afternoon and online attest to how beloved she is at UConn. So for nearly a quarter of a century, Shareen has been a leader making human rights visible at our university and beyond. She embodies what we call an engaged scholar, bringing her critical and humane insights to any committee work she may participate in, and I've seen this play out over 2 decades in her efforts with the President's Committee on Corporate Social Responsibility, born of student protest around labor rights violations in the early 2000s, brought to light with regard to the manufacture of UConn apparel, especially the apparel you buy after you win a national championship in basketball. So finally, I'll say a few words about Shareen's connectedness to Wiktor. She respected him as an educator, scholar, and human rights defender. They would often discuss the nature of human rights and its limits. She constantly pressed him to recognize that civil and political rights weren't the only rights that mattered, that economic and social rights were human rights as well. She championed Wiktor in the classroom. He always spoke to her 1,000-level classes, to her seminars. And the day before he would lecture in her class, she prepared her students. She prepared them quite carefully. I used to co-teach with her, so I could see this happening. She'd say, it's really important to actively listen to Wiktor. He's often soft-spoken. He's an incredible human being. She'd note, this may be the only chance you ever have to talk to one of the most significant architects of a modern constitution, one that took human rights seriously. And she would note, he will always come and speak to you without notes, without PowerPoints, without props, and you'll be surprised at how much you learn. So in a similar way, Shareen captivates students, many of whom become human rights majors or minors, or graduate thinking differently about how they will carry out their work in the world. I always recall Wiktor speaking to others in the human rights world, saying that human rights at UConn, a land-grant school serving the state of Connecticut, was the way human rights should be situated in higher education. Accessible and dynamic and practice-oriented. So the Connecticut School of Human Rights foregrounds applying human rights ideals and principles in practice across disciplines, across fields of work. And it's in that context that we'll hear from Professor Shareen Hertel today. Following her formal remarks, we'll have plenty of time for questions and engagement, and then please stay for a beautiful reception. Welcome, Shareen.
So that is an extraordinary introduction and a gift to see so many people here. And I'm really grateful to Kathy for acknowledging the breadth of people in the audience. You all know me, but I know you, and you don't necessarily know each other. But you are reflective of the way we do human rights at the University of Connecticut. And this talk is one that I gave a version of last week at Columbia in the context of a celebration of my advisor's career. And there I had to convince people. Here I don't. Before you came to this auditorium today, you chose what to wear, you chose what to eat, you chose the mode of transportation, and every single one of those choices was consequential. In some cases, you elected fair trade coffee. And in others, when you or I use our cell phone, we're using a device that's essential for human life, but that we don't necessarily control the environment. We can manage the supply chain only up to a certain point. And so for me, the privilege of teaching at UConn as a political scientist has been being able to work with engineers and with colleagues in the social sciences across fields and with colleagues in the arts to bring to life the issues that we're going to talk about today. I promise I'm not going to give a depressing human rights talk. The world is depressing enough. I promise I will give you hope, because every single one of us understands the rights I'm going to talk about today. We have all been children, and we will all get old. And many of us work for pay, but plenty of people who matter in our lives have cared for us uncompensated. And we want to make sure that we value all of that work. And so many of you are doing transformative work that impacts economic and social rights in really significant ways. And my hope in talking to you today is to leave you with a sense of being empowered enough to have, as Kathy mentioned, the conversation on the plane about these issues in a way that invites an invitation to conversation instead of foreclosing our political space. I tell people often that I used to tell people I was a professor when I would sit next to them on the plane, or I used to say I taught human rights, but I stopped over the past decade or so. And I say I work on supply chains. And it doesn't matter how the person votes, because they're interested. They'll say to me, well, what do you do with supply chains? And I say, well, I work on understanding who made your shoes, or who harvested your coffee beans, or how that supply chain works in a really complex way. And I'm smiling seeing students who actually manage supply chains in the audience, who've been through my classes, who've gone out and shaped that field. And I'm smiling because I see colleagues in business and in geography and in political science who are doing work on the legal or social frameworks that make those things possible. So I'm going to start with 2 or 3 somewhat depressing slides, but they're only intended to pique your concern and to show you why these issues are so consequential. When I wrote my dissertation many years ago, I had to persuade my advisors that it was okay to have the word economic rights in the title, and that I really would get a job. I got a job. I helped define that field here collaboratively with all of you. And we're working on the issues of human rights that are most legible to average people. Everyone wants a life that is better for their child than they had. Everyone wants their aging parent to be treated with dignity. All of us are invested in not dying when we go to work, and in consuming responsibly so that the planet we love and want to steward can exist past us. And I would argue that this issue area within the human rights field of economic and social rights is the one that will help us save human rights for everyone, because it invites a conversation. So I'm going to start by saying, realistically, we live in very unequal times. The century that multiplied wealth more than any time in human history, the 19th and early 20th centuries, increased inequality more than any time. In over 70% of the countries in the world, domestic inequality, domestic within the country, has increased really significantly. 60 years ago, an executive earned about 21 times the line worker's salary. I'm from Michigan. I'm from a big manufacturing space. 21 times. Today, it's 281 times more. The example of these ratios, Amazon 43 to 1, Lowe's 59 to 1, Starbucks 6,669 times to 1, give you a sense of how extraordinary our inequality has become. In 2025 and 6, the top 10% of households in our own country accounted for 50% of consumer spending, but a third of all people in the US couldn't cover a $400 emergency expense. So these economic rights are driving political polarization. And they're driving it not only here, but they're driving it globally. So what do we do about that? My invitation isn't to depress you and make you feel guilty and stop drinking coffee tomorrow. It's to think about the systems in which we're embedded and the incremental and meaningful structural changes that we can make collaboratively because you're at a space and a place with people who are willing to talk across the aisle politically and to use varied toolkits. This is a graph that just really quickly shows you that inequality. The darker the color, the more unequal. This gives you a sense of how profoundly unequal our world is. And this is the gross change in ratio of inequality in those executive pay gaps. And the fight against poverty has stalled in some ways globally. Debt as a percentage of GDP is growing, growth is slowing, and the dismantling of USAID, which we've watched, the United States Agency for International Development, means that in 2025, we spent more in the United States on Halloween candy than we did on development assistance. And that exacerbates inequality and contingent anxiety. So we can see that fight against poverty stalling, and we can see our Halloween candy now surpassing our spending on foreign development assistance. So those are my only depressing slides. Because I want to argue really centrally, we have the tools to begin to tackle these problems, and we can build a political and social consensus around doing so. I feel incredibly blessed to be at UConn. I feel incredibly fortunate to be in a land-grant university. I feel extraordinarily lucky to have half my family have PhDs and half my family work as contractors, because they give me insights that span the gamut on the types of solutions we need to tackle this kind of inequality. The economic rights framework is really simple. There are three basic elements of economic and social rights. The basic subsistence rights we need to exist as human beings: food, shelter, minimal literacy, minimal health access, the right to equal access to work and decent treatment at work, and basic income guarantees for people who can't work. And here I owe a tremendous debt to Wiktor Osiatyński, because Wiktor and I would often tussle over how much is that minimum floor. Wiktor wrote a book very famously, Human Rights and Their Limits. As he used to love to tell me, the Soviets promised everything in the Constitution and delivered nothing. So there is a basic income guarantees. You all know intuitively what they are. In the United States, we think of Social Security. But in many parts of Western Europe, I'm looking out at my colleagues who are Europeans, pre-K may be covered. All of that daycare that we spend a huge chunk of our salary on in our country is covered in some places. So that safety net differs and varies. And that's also part of the extraordinary utility of the economic and social rights framework. These rights are progressively realized. None of us have them all figured out now, but we have an obligation collectively to continually do better. We're at different jumping off points as nation states and within them. But all of us are striving for a world that becomes more equal. And that becomes the focus then for our negotiation over who gets what, and our negotiation of how to build coalitions of mutual interest. Economic and social rights are really obvious. When I tell people on the plane that I work on supply chains, I don't have to explain anything else, particularly post-pandemic. They are integral to our daily lives. I don't have the burden that some of my colleagues who teach constitutional law or the law of war have in trying to explain. My colleague I'm looking at, Dave Richards, teaches torture. What is torture? How do we define it? How do we define genocide? Economic rights are much more intuitively obvious to people. They're very integral to the daily life. I drew you in by saying all of you engaged in economic rights behaviors because you consumed food when you got up in the morning. We will consume infinitely more times than we will ever vote in our lives. So we use our consumption in some ways as a proxy for then living those values. The products we use, who manufactured them. There's an entire body of work. I'm smiling and seeing my colleague Rachel Chambers and Robert Bird and others in the School of Business, Nicole, who are working to define what it means to have traceability in supply chains. And I see my alum Taylor, who works within a company on due diligence for managing that supply chain. So who manufactured that product? Where did it come from? Where did its some subcomponents come from? And the places we work, are they safe? Ergonomically? Ambientally? Are they safe? Are they well? My doctoral candidate funded through the Osiatyński Chair, Corey Runstedler, is writing a dissertation that compares labor rights, well-being of workers in warehouses in the United States and Canada. The largest single fine levied in Connecticut ever for child labor was for kids driving forklifts at Walmart. And I see my alum, Haween, who's shaking her head because she works with children at risk. That's in one of the richest states in the United States of America. So we want to be sure we're safe at work. That's not a big reach. Under 18, you don't drive the forklift, end of story. Services, can somebody with a disability engage in using public services? And if so, how? My engineering students are phenomenal interlocutors in my classes that I co-teach because they often will use great examples. They'll say to my non-engineering students, the curb cut you have today, my civil engineers say, is in part because it's enabling a person with a wheelchair to use that surface, but it's also very helpful to those of you with a baby carriage or a shopping cart. And the curb cut then becomes both an accessibility tool, but also broadens our shared stake in accessibility. All the voice-activated software we use on our phones and our computers is thanks to our colleagues in the community with disabilities who lobbied hard and pushed to ensure that they too could participate in using the World Wide Web. And we all benefit. I talk to Siri all the time on my phone. I'm very, very chatty. I tell her what to do. So can somebody with a disability use it? And is the contracting of the service fair? These are really intuitive, obvious elements of economic rights. Economic rights are very practical. I am a very practical person, and I told you I would give you a pragmatic talk, right? What can we do? We can use them to forge tools for defining the bottom line for fairness and safety in different places. Remember, I told you they're progressively realized. All of us are going to consume at differential levels, but our goal is a life with human dignity. And so if we think about defining the bottom line for fairness, a living wage isn't something I'm going to tell you here in Connecticut about. I'm going to engage with my students from Bangladesh in working with local NGOs to define what that means for the worker who made your sweatshirt in Bangladesh. Because it costs a very different cost of life is very different in Bangladesh from in Connecticut. And we can also think about rules for brokering the use of resources. I'm really happy to see a whole posse of my colleagues from the Institute for the Environment and Energy and the Environment, because we're having to really think through the tragedy of the global commons. And we're having to think through strategies for managing, particularly in the current moment, energy access. But a number of us here, and I'm going to show a slide subsequently on it, are also thinking about energy justice right here in Connecticut. Access to energy in a rural and or urban setting is differential, and vulnerability is different. And I'll talk about that in a few moments. And then strategies to increase transparency in supply chains in particular, but in other realms, and to reduce risk. These are all elements of the practical nature of economic rights. They're very intuitive. They don't take a PhD, they don't take a law degree. And in fact, some of our most trenchant partners in defining these types of strategies or rules are people who do the work themselves at the local level. My nephews who weld pipe in Michigan are going to be much more helpful to me in defining risks and hazards in the green economy than I am, right? And so that epistemic humility, we call it, the ability to say to someone, I don't know, is something economic rights constantly forces us to do. I love to say to people when I teach with engineering, the engineers always complain that there's too much reading, and the political science students always complain that there are too many graphs. And the art students really get annoyed with all of them. So I find that teaching this way forces me to have to listen. All my analogies I'm giving you are thanks to this interdisciplinary work I do. And they are definitely practically oriented rights. They're very dynamic. They are not the same for everyone, everywhere, all at once. By statute, the manner in which human rights law is written, economic rights are realized progressively more fully over time. The century that multiplied wealth more than any grossly increased inequality, but it's also a period in which we outlawed chattel slavery. Doesn't mean trafficking is over. We all know human trafficking still happens, but we no longer have legalized slavery. So they're dynamic. They're progressively realized in each community, each industry, and each country differently. And the hope I have is that we benchmark against best practices, constantly thinking about the arc of history being quite long and benchmarking up, not down. So this idea that Wiktor had very fundamentally in his work, there's a floor, but we have to have them be aspirational, applies directly to economic rights as well. They create guardrails. They're really crucial to helping us think through how to prevent harm and discrimination, but also how to establish a floor for access so we can regulate industry and services more carefully, and we can broker interaction among state and non-state actors. All of us have an obligation to get up in the morning and in some way contribute to our own families, to our own communities, to the places we are employed for pay, or to the type of care work we do without pay. And when people fall into difficult circumstances, that basic social safety net, unemployment insurance, disability insurance, can be used to ensure a life with dignity. But we broker those kinds of floors through discourse, through the deliberative process in society and legally. And we broker that interaction through legal means, and we broker it in common conversation. I'm not kidding when I tell you, when I used to say I was a professor of human rights, people would clam up and never talk to me again on the plane. Now that I tell people I teach supply chains, by the end of the plane, they've asked for my card. And we probably don't vote the same way. And that's the first step towards being able to broker a conversation about economic rights. This is a number of the images you're seeing, and I want to credit Betsy Pittman, who has been one of the deep stewards of our work. The archive we have on human rights photography is really unparalleled. Robin Romano's work is here, and it was in some of the earlier slides. But this is a photograph of a little girl who's harvesting apples. I have many family members in the Midwest who farm. It's not to say your kid can't farm, but let's think about then pesticide exposure. If we calibrate all pesticides based on an adult male, we should be thinking about calibration of pesticide exposure that would be reasonable for children. Is this little girl doing farm work during school hours? Is she not? Is she doing it on her own family's farm, or is she contract labor? It's very intuitive for me to talk with people about child labor. If I asked for a show of hands of how many people worked in high school, I'm pretty sure everybody's hand would go up. But my example of kids driving forklifts in Connecticut in a Walmart facility is where you draw the line. So I'm not saying no child labor. I'm saying let's think about the distinction between the most hazardous forms of child work and acceptable forms of child work. We can also think about that intuitive obviousness with slavery and hazardous work. We have very good laws on the books in the United States. I have to defer to my colleagues like Virginia Hediger and others who do work on constitutional law in the US, which is often a companion to once we ratify an international treaty. How do we implement it? We implement it through domestic laws. We also implement it through voluntary standards. And it's very intuitively obvious. We have lots of bipartisan consensus around things like child slavery. Now it's about pushing that consensus a little bit farther to apply to these other things like living wage. How do we safeguard children's rights? This is one area where I've done lots of research in Latin America and in South Asia and in the United States. This is an area of great mutual concern because we've all been children and we feel tender towards children whether we have them or not. I would argue another frontier area where I see a lot of consonance is around elder care. Many of us who are in a sandwiched generation are worried about who's going to care for our elder. And in the current climate where we're having a big debate around immigration, I don't know. We send all the folks home who've been caring for your grandma. I don't know who's going to do that work. So thinking about our lives extending from childhood through old age is also a way of building these bridging conversations around economic rights. There's also a really dynamic space where we can think about technological change. I am officially, compared to my college-age daughter, a Luddite. I will never be as fast as she is in using new technology. I want to think, though, about how to equip workers for adjusting to new and changing technologies. And again, this is an economic rights question. It's not to say technology has to stop tomorrow, but how do we think about moving people into other types of occupations, work with dignity, work that's remunerative, work that ideally could be unionized or otherwise protected, if they have been bypassed by technology? And how and what can we do to cushion those types of transitions? Coming from the Midwest, this is not an incidental question. The robotization of manufacturing in the United States is going to be, lots of people are left out of the workforce. Where are they going to go? They can't all become greeters at Walmart. There just aren't enough greeters. So we really are in a moment where I am so grateful to this work I do with colleagues across the STEM human rights divide, because I don't have the skill set to fundamentally understand necessarily the commercialization of new forms of technology. I see my colleague Anna in the back row, but she does. And together we can be thinking about, when I commercialize that new technology, how might we think about building in either open source access to patents in some areas and or phased integration where we're thinking about what happens to workers who don't have the technical skills. Economic and social rights transcend borders. So I've given you lots of examples from my life here in the US, but we could ask for a whole series of other examples from your countries of origin. I know enough of you to know we probably have at least 15 to 20 countries represented in the room alone. This is a beautiful photo. I'm going to give a little synopsis of what it is. It's a photo of students from Engineering Without Borders working on a latrine building project in Peru. And I used to show this photo in many kinds of contexts until my colleague Davis Chacon-Hurtado said, Shareen, do you know what this actually is? Davis is my colleague with whom I direct our Engineering for Human Rights. He said, this is a blessing. My father, Davis's father, helped be a cultural interlocutor with this community who only speak Quechua. He said, before we could dig the latrine and work on the plumbing, we had to have a blessing of the space and the land from the community members. And they wanted to make sure that the kids were there for the blessing. So this is also economic, social, and cultural rights at work, right? The American engineering kids are standing off to the side because they don't speak Quechua. They don't even speak Spanish very well, but they're respectfully waiting to commence work on the project until the blessing is finished. And the impact of climate change in this context is really affecting the ecosystem of the highland Andes. And so food, shelter, energy, and health is really significantly impacted. And our students are part of this embedded process over multiple cohorts of students going back and forth, working on sanitation solutions within these communities. Again, this is economic rights work in progress, economic, social, and cultural rights in this case. So one of the really exciting things to come out of this type of work is then being able to gather data. All of us good social scientists and hard scientists are going to gather data, but we're going to do so collaboratively with communities where we have long-standing relationships. And as a land-grant school, for us, it's been extraordinarily exciting to see students have the opportunity to travel, to study, to be rooted in that community, and then to pass the baton to the next cohort of students who are going to sustain that project. Now I'm going to do my shout out to all sorts of people who have made these types of programs possible, to Dean Kazem Kazaronian, to all of my colleagues who have been working on Engineering for Human Rights. This is our program in Economic and Social Rights and its sister program on Engineering for Human Rights Initiative. These are two of the programs that I've been most fundamentally involved in my career here, and I couldn't do any of that work if I didn't have those types of relationships. My colleague Sebastian Wogenstein, with whom I've co-directed the Connecticut Baden-Württemberg Human Rights Research Consortium, a small satellite project of that with my colleague Anka Finger and Arash Zaghi and Douglas Kaufman in the School of Ed, so engineering, digital media, and design, and education, worked on digital literacy for children in the Hartford school system and in immigrant communities within Germany to prevent a second digital divide. If we know, remember from 2 or 3 slides ago, that people are going to be bypassed by technology unless we start thinking about how to equip people with the tools to use it. This was a series of encounters that were done over multiple days in both sites, in Germany and in the US, with kids who would otherwise have no access. We had many kids in the Hartford Public Library who'd never heard of AI or understood what it was. So even just a basic acquaintanceship so that they're safe in using it, but that also they are aware for it in the context of the types of work that they might have to do. To my colleagues Francisco and Elle, this is a project we've been doing with our colleagues at UAlbany in the Weather Information Systems Project. This is a grid, a power restoration grid that's developed a sensitivity analysis for economic disparity. In a state like Connecticut, when the power goes out, differentially impacted people have very different experiences. If you are poor and low income in Hartford and the power goes out, you lose all the food in your fridge. If you don't have access to a generator. If you live in rural Connecticut and the power goes out and you don't have an access to a generator, you can't flush the toilet. But in the same class, I might have students from Westchester or from Fairfield County who've never had the power go out because they have a whole house generator. This sensitivity analysis says when you restore the grid, thank you, Francisco, you're not going to just restore it with raw numbers. You're going to restore it with a differential understanding that restoring it in more economically marginalized areas or areas where there are elders using a CPAP machine is going to be an important differential in thinking. And how do we create something that power companies can use that takes those issues into consideration? So these are just a few examples of the way that this economic rights legibility, accessibility, translational work, deeply practical work is happening at UConn. Another area, and I promised my colleague Kyle Muncy I was going to give a shout out to our almost 20-year history together in working on managing UConn's own supply chain. Rachel Chambers, Robert Bird, and others have been integral to this work. UConn is one of the leading universities in the country, trial by fire, at managing our own supply chain. Only 3% of all apparel in the United States is as closely audited as is the collegiate apparel space. 97% of the rest of apparel, it's much harder to trace. There are plenty of voluntary initiatives. We know that in Europe we've developed due diligence laws that are beginning to make transparency a regulation, but it remains very difficult. However, collegiate apparel is much easier to manage. In part, if you click here, we have a vendor code of conduct, but if you were to go a little further down csr.uconn.edu, you could click an interactive file which would show you down to the street level every single vendor we work with all over the world who makes your dog. That's pretty remarkable. And that's something I'm incredibly proud of having worked on for 20 years. But there are challenges. And so I told you I wouldn't depress you. I would only give some sad slides up front. I'm going to give a realistic appraisal of some of the challenges. Self-interests make it very difficult to achieve economic and social rights fulfillment. We are going to have to pay more if we want products that are properly traced through the supply chain and potentially consume less. And it's probably okay. I'm not going to do it today, but when I ask in class who has at least one pair of jeans, everybody's hand goes up. Keep your hand up if you have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I've had students turn totally red. I don't shame and blame. That's not my interest in teaching, but it helps us think about our own level of consumption. There are dominant coalitions that have benefited from inequality. We know this with trade theory, for example, and there are superficial ways we can say we're compliant and not really mean it. And there's a lot of difficulty. I gave you my example of UConn and managing the dog. Generalizing beyond that to all other universities is challenging. It's an issue of scale shift. So I'm not trying to be naive and say that if everybody believes in economic and social rights, everything will be fine. these are real challenges to acknowledge, and the book I did in 2019 really looks at how to engage people at local community levels in the communities where we manufacture products globally to think about their challenges. And I want to give you a really beautiful example from one of the interviews. I did a global assessment with large N analysis of all of the types of ways we can consult with people, and then 2 very deep dives into case studies in the Dominican Republic in communities where we produce UConn product. And in one of the interviews in the community, I was trying to look at the different perceptions of communities, because in one case, Haynes, the large manufacturer, used very traditional corporate philanthropy and very traditional monitoring. And in the other case, Altagracia and Via Altagracia was a factory that was paying 3 times the minimum wage in the Dominican Republic, but only employed about 200 people. 3,500, 200. And I was really interested in the community members' perceptions of these different approaches to business and human rights. So in the Haynes community, one of my respondents said, "Doña, please turn off the tape recorder. I'm so inarticulate, I don't want anyone to hear." So I said, "Okay, I'll turn it off. I'll just take notes." She said, "I'll tell you what would be really helpful. Every year, my kids get a backpack. It's very nice. Haynes gives everybody a backpack. But for 14 years, we've been getting 2 backpacks because I have 2 kids. I don't need 28 backpacks. You know what would be really helpful, Doña? Is if they put solar panels on the factory. And then we could load share with the factory to the community center, because in the Dominican Republic, we have a faulty power grid. And we have sequenced power cuts every day in different hours. In my neighborhood, it's from 3 to 5. That's just when my kids come home from school and I'm trying to cook dinner. And if they did that load sharing instead of the backpacks, I could not only make dinner and the kids could do homework at the community center, but we wouldn't have to smell all that terrible diesel that the generators kick on when they continue manufacturing with diesel generators. And they'd be more green. They'd look good because they'd be more green because they'd be using solar power. And this is the lady who told me to turn off the tape because she says, I'm so inarticulate. So I really would argue that we have to use those case studies and generalize beyond them to thinking bigger and more emancipatorily about what we can do, each of us in our own conversations, each of us in our own ways of consuming, each of us in the types of causes that we want to champion. And universities play a really key role in this. And I am so privileged to be at the University of Connecticut, to have built these programs around economic rights and around economic and social rights on the one hand, engineering for human rights, the Baden-Württemberg work. It's been extraordinary because we can create alliances to develop new tools and systems. The types of tools for sensitivity analysis of the power grid are something I don't have the skill set to do, but I can certainly tell you where poor people are. And with El Wilmette, my colleague in anthropology, we can say to Francisco and to Rosbatzglou, let's build this together, right? Putting those tools in the public arena with my colleagues who work in other spaces is tremendous. I'm not a social work professor like Kathy, and I am the least creative person who's a hanger-on of the Arts and Human Rights cluster. But we had a marvelous student in arts and design who did an entirely sustainable artistic project 2 years ago using mycelium. I didn't even know what mycelium was. But she said it costs so much to put up these art installations with plastic and all these materials. Let me try to make it from biodegradable materials. I'm sure someone would love to commercialize this idea. She's a brilliant student who's gone on to do her MFA. And I had the privilege of just being part of evaluating her honors project. We also have professors and students and alumni, as I mentioned, to those people working on supply chain management who've been my mentees now, right now. And we can send students to intern in those places. And we can invite those folks to be parts of committees and projects. The work I did for the 2019 book in the Dominican Republic would have never happened if I didn't serve on the President's Committee on CSR. And they create tremendous opportunities. Our place here at University of Connecticut creates opportunities for us social scientists, engineers, professors across all of the professional schools, education, business, social work, agriculture, to do this type of work collaboratively. We engage with tradespeople I've done lots and lots of work looking at how to move towards a green economy that makes me have to work with the Connecticut Building and Trades Union. I feel very comfortable talking to them. They love me because my family are actually contractors and they will tell me what's happening. Elle and I have worked with them very, very closely. We would love to get grants where we could build more green jobs. We work from all colleges and schools. At all campuses, students can take human rights courses, and we have literally the only program in the country where there's a engineering for human rights degree within the School of Engineering, and where students across all majors and minors can be doing this type of interdisciplinary work. And we work across Connecticut and across the region and globally on these types of challenges. So my invitation to you today is to be inspired to find out more. Erica McDonald-LaPlante is here, who runs our hub. These are pictures, thanks to Erica, from multiple projects. Mike is in the back there, Mike Rubin. You can talk to him if you want to be part of his projects, but these are all projects that are hosted. Jeremy Pressman, who's here, runs the Crowd Counting Consortium in our hub. So please bring your interdisciplinary skills. Many of them will relate to economic rights, others might not. And please think about the manner in which doing so will decrease the risks that we face, this global inequality, the polarization politically and socially, the economic hazards and risks. But I'm not dwelling on the negative. I'm pushing you to think about the positive, to shore up socially and environmentally sustainable systems, and to reshape the rules of policymaking. I told you you'll consume infinitely more times than you will ever vote in your life, but please vote. Please think about how to engage economically with the people at the precarious level in our own society. Remember, a third of the population now doesn't have $400 for an unanticipated expense. We need people in the audience who have this broad skill set and these extraordinary capacities for communication to think about what works and doesn't. The lady who told me in the DR, I don't need 28 backpacks, I really need solar panels, is someone we need to be listening to. And we can only do so if we dare to forge alliances with people whose skills are different, whose life walk is different, whose place socially or otherwise is different from ours. Because economic and social rights really, honestly, are a source of hope. And with that, I'm ready to take questions.
You're going to get a different mic.
Okay.
Yes, turn that one off.
Just want to switch this out for her so it's a little bit better sounding.
Okay.
Thank you. So I'm going to take the prerogative of asking the first question.
All right.
And it's in part because I think you only got a hint of the kinds of conversations that Shareen and Wiktor had around economic and social rights issues. So I'm going to ask you to give us a bit more painted picture of what that conversation looked like and some of the ideas that you both batted around.
Absolutely. So Wiktor and I taught together my first year here, and I think Haween Flexer is in the back row. And Haween was in the class where Wiktor actually taught this class with me. And Wiktor would always guest lecture, but in my first year here, he actually taught with me. And he used to say to me after class, Shareen, you keep telling them that these are rights, but in the US, your Constitution is silent on these rights. You can't keep calling them rights. And I said, Wiktor, I'm going to tell you something. Americans don't care if they're in the Constitution or not. They're going to stand up and protest until they are included in statute in some manner. We may not change the Constitution, but Americans will not be silent. And he grumbled and grumbled. And the next fall, when he came back, he said, I thought a lot about what you said. And I said, social movements will push, Wiktor. Social movements will push until such point. Robin Romano's beautiful photographs on child labor were integrated into scholastic readers that teachers' unions very smartly sent home in the early 1990s. We passed legislation to prevent the importation of products made knowingly with forced child labor. It's called the hot goods provision. When a container arrives in the port of Newark, it can be sent back upon entry if there's knowing use of forced child labor. Forced meaning enslaved child labor. That's the result of many kids looking at Robin Romano's photographs in scholastic readers for the early 1990s and parents pushing. That's also the result, honestly, of corporate actors themselves saying this is too significant a risk. I'm willing to begin to do due diligence in my supply chain. And I was really privileged to work on those issues. So I would push back with Wiktor with these examples. And he came back and he said, okay, I will grant you. You can call them rights because they're not in the Constitution of the United States, because he was a constitutional lawyer. But I understand you're saying social movements won't rest until we address some of these issues.
I think one of the things that really struck me was when Wiktor passed away in 2017, but he would come every year, and sometimes he would stay for 3 weeks, sometimes he would stay for 6 weeks. But when he came around the time that President Trump was starting to gain some ascendancy, he had said that really we're starting to see a situation where the social mobilization really matters. The law itself on its own isn't going to fix all of our problems. I think if he was here today, I'm just guessing, but I think he would actually really hold in high regard lawyers as human rights defenders. So he might actually pull back a little bit and say, we need them both. We need the social mobilization, but we also need those who are going to press for the recognition of the rule of law.
Wiktor also was really interesting. There was a student, Haween would know him, who was very active in the movement to legalize marijuana. And Wiktor was a huge member of the recovery community. He brought AA to Eastern Europe. He single-handedly spearheaded the inclusion of a conversation around alcoholism in Eastern Europe during the transition to democracy and was deeply, deeply involved. And so one of these students at UConn who was pushing for legalization invited Wiktor to come speak to their group of students. And he went at night. They were meeting somewhere lost in the student union. He couldn't find it, but he was totally excited. And he came back the next day and he said, these kids are brilliant. They have a strategy that will prevent people from these minor offenses that are ridiculous, that are going to impact their lives. And they're more likely to use controlled substances responsibly if it's not attached to criminality. And so Wiktor was one of these people who the kid in class heard talk about his passion for recovery, invited, and then Wiktor himself would go back and visit this student group. And I'm still on their mailing list. I cannot figure out why I keep getting all of this information. But that's a legacy of Wiktor Osiatyński. So there you go.
I think you're the only professor at UConn that's on that mailing list, as well as the baseball team's mailing list. So, okay.
Exactly.
So we're going to open up the floor for other questions.
Don't be shy.
Raise your hand and you will have the microphone. So right here, Dan.
Well, thank you for a wonderful lecture. And I know Wiktor would be very proud of this lecture, so thank you for that. So in the course of my career, I've watched the so-called progressive left transitioned from focuses on social class to a whole myriad forms of identity, what some people might call identity politics, and for all kinds of good reasons, because oppression takes many forms and many shapes, and identity is an important piece of that. But listening to your talk today, I'm wondering whether we really took our eye off the ball in terms of issues of class and inequality, which makes it harder for us to focus on these central issues.
I think it's a great point. And my grad students in the back row are smiling because the first day of our grad seminar, which this semester is on contentious politics, so there are a whole bunch of them here, I said, every one of you is a hybrid person. You bring multiple identities to the table. In our class alone this semester, I think we speak at least upwards of 10 languages, mother tongues, 10. This is a group of 10 students, and some speak multiple languages. They have different lived experiences. They have different work experiences. And so rather than balkanizing each other and separating off by groups, it's to be thinking about, just as we do in an interdisciplinary sense, I cannot make that beautiful interactive map of Connecticut that Francesco can. But he needs Elle and me to help him figure out how to find the data on inequality and then how to rationally discern between all of the possible soup of data what's going to be most trenchant. And it means I have to be humble enough to say, I have no clue how he put that beautiful graphic together. And he will say to Elle and me, please, give me the synoptic version of what's most useful. And I will often say to students in my class, we began last week saying, how do you say the word gender in multiple languages? And where is gender different from sex? That's an incredibly helpful way of engaging, because I'm not ignoring the fact that we come from 10 languages, or we all are different in our life walk and experience, but I'm not privileging one group over the other. I'm saying we all bring these multiple lenses. And I think one of the most exciting and also wonderful things to realize, it's just like my curb cut example when my civil engineers will tell me this curb cut is very useful, is that all this hybrid identity we bring to the table makes us better at solving problems. So rather than saying your identity doesn't give you a pass to even be part of the conversation, it's to say I need as many different vantage points as possible in order to more effectively solve problems. Yes.
Hi, Shareen. I know you want to end up with a very positive message, but I can't but be a bit pragmatist.
That's okay.
I think something that is happening in the world is, 2026 is way different than 2025. And, if we keep looking back, the world has changed enormously. And one of those concerning changes is the politicization of human rights, right? So in a way, there was some sort of ideological understanding that the foundation of human rights was universal, right? So that would cut across ideologies, countries, and so on. But in recent years, we've noticed this kind of appropriation of the human rights, framework or critique to that framework based on ideology, right? So in a way, human rights are the gateway to something else, or human rights, why do we have to be restrained by some, why each country has to obey to a foreign kind of framework that forces us to do X and Y and Z and so on. So maybe with that pragmatism, and maybe we can appeal to your optimism, how can you push back on the politicization of human rights, and how can we advocate more efficiently to that growing, dissonance in terms of, what the purpose of human rights are and the political climate?
That's a great question. And I think for me, I am in a very fortunate position working on economic and social rights, because there's not a one-size-fits-all standard. There are a series of basic fundamental principles that we want to allow people to not drop below that are quite intuitive, but they're progressively realized. So I'm not telling you that I, in the Great White North, am insisting that you have this as your minimum wage. They're progressively realized. And so that in and of itself has been really helpful for me in saying to people, let's dialogue about what is realistic in your context. The example I'll often give is of universal primary education. If a country has limited resources and it decides, I'm going to make sure everyone goes through 7th grade, or the country can make the decision, well, all the boys are going to go through high school, but those girls are only going to become housewives, so they're going to go through 6th grade. That's not going to be acceptable. And so that's the tussle, like you say, the universal idea that there's a threshold or a floor, but it's often less difficult to convince people of the floor in the area of economic and social rights. And I think in part because they're very dialogic. So another example, we were just talking with my class the other day, was what would be the constraints on girls' education? One might be access to contraception and sex education. So in that context, how do I engage traditional religious or other authorities in the conversation so that I make it even possible to widen that conversation? So sometimes looking at ILO 182, the Convention on the Worst Forms of Child Labor, is a place I'll begin with people. Does anyone really want their child to do work so hazardous they die? That's an easier conversation to have with someone because it's pretty intuitive. But I hear you. And the critique is often as much from the conservative right as it is from the extreme left. I have colleagues who will tell me, why do you even bother working on human rights, Shareen? The whole regime is corrupted by states. And I often will say, because I work with workers who have to go to a factory, to put food on the table for their family. And so I'm willing to use the tools of the international human rights regime because they're going to be written into the codes of conduct of the company anyway. I'm not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That person has to show up at work. So we have an intellectual luxury of dismissing the entire human rights regime, but a lot of people who go to a factory every day don't. And they're actually quite often willing interlocutors with me in persuading people who say the whole regime is bunk, you shouldn't bother, give up. I've literally had somebody say, why do you teach human rights? You might as well teach about the Easter Bunny and Santa Claus. Oh, well, I'm happy to. But it's challenging.
Merci, thank you. Do I need that? Hello, Shareen, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm poorly and I want to help you, but I'm from the community. I'm not from the university, but that speaks to me so strongly, the human rights in general, because I was in Guatemala, I was in Germany, I lived in Germany for 5 years. Everything was made in Germany there, I was like, wow, it's impressive that, and I'm ready to pay more, made in USA, and the boycott too, I'm surprised that people don't boycott more than that here sometimes, I feel strongly part of boycotting stuff sometimes to help the situation of the people. So I don't know.
So this is one of the really interesting questions. And I think this is where I'm so grateful. The Human Rights Institute has had a really strong focus on getting out into the community through dialogue programs and other things. And potentially what you're pointing to is more information on ethical consumption. So that may be an area that we will want to think about, is how can you help consumers themselves know more about what they're consuming? I worked in the early to mid 90s with a group that was doing a shopper's guide for a better world, where you could know what company was behind the label of the product and how that company rated on a series of social and environmental indicators. I think that kind of information is very empowering to people. So I agree.
And I wish sometime we apply that stuff here in stores, directly here, with the garbage like we produced and all the plastic we are doing here. And, beginning here too sometime, and I'm happy to help other countries. But I would like to be involved with that sometime, even as a community member. I'm very concerned in general.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. An example I will often give to people is that as a kid growing up, my mother would drive 13 miles round trip to recycle because there was no recycling in my part of the Midwest when I was a young kid. There was no curbside recycling. And my mother was very passionate about recycling. And now it's part of our trash program. Now, are we doing it as efficiently as we should? No. So then we have to be thinking almost like a life cycle analysis. We aren't there.
Yeah, or sending the garbage to the third world country too. At one point, I think UConn is not green to me for a lot of stuff. But, just trying to help the situation for some of the stuff, you know what I mean?
That's a huge issue. Where does the trash end up?
Yeah.
The garbage barge kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, no.
Thank you, Professor. That was terrific.
Thank you.
My question is, you started off one slide with this activity that you do in your classes about how many genes everyone owns. And then you ended that same slide with talking about what happens when there's systemic change, kind of, as though there's a progression between individual responsibility and systemic corporate accountability. There's another school of thought that says individual responsibility is really just corporations pushing back and so they don't have to do their part, take their part in all of this and take their responsibility in all of this. So I'm wondering how you think of this. Are these two separate frameworks, or is it really more of a progression from one to the other?
It's a really great question. And it's a hard question to end with. So I had given... So Martin, he did the downer question, but this is even the harder question. So they're double downers, but they're good. They're good questions. They're really important questions. So I had a slide where I said there were rigged rules. We developed the WTO with no social clause and with no environmental clause. And we set up trade rules that externalize those costs, externalize the cost of the plastic, externalize the cost of other things. I think we're reaching a tipping point where the precarity of those kinds of rule structures, both the social consequences of this galloping inequality and the environmental consequence of where do we end up with the plastic, China said, I don't want it anymore, makes us have to think, are we going to rewrite rules? In the moment, we're not observing them anyway in the United States, which is really problematic on many levels. But I do think there's a place for really reimagining how we set rules, because we cannot continue to externalize the cost of this inequality and of unsustainability. And so economic rights as a framework, economic and social rights, force us to have to think through, if we're going to say, Susan Randolph's work, and I'm hoping she's online from the West Coast, was to create a production possibilities frontier to rank countries for their fulfillment of economic rights, where you'd have an ideal point based on their resource endowment. But if they're not using those resources effectively, there's a penalty point and they get a lower grade, so to speak. I think we have to start thinking, superficiality isn't enough, and externalities, just externalizing all of these costs indefinitely, isn't enough. So you're right. An individual consumer is like Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the hill until the rights can be embedded in the rule structures. That also extends to our taxation regime, corporate welfare, et cetera. We really, and that's why I said to everybody, please vote. Don't just consume, please vote. You're right. The individual impetus would be overridden by these system-wide inequalities. But I think it's incredibly important to point out to average consumers that you have the power to demand these types of changes. If we think about the intuitiveness of product safety standards, nobody wants to die using a product. Underwriters Lab light bulbs are safe. They're safe because people used to die from electric light bulbs. So I think we have to really think about changing rule structures. I completely agree with you. So thank you, everybody, for really hard, good questions. For this opportunity, come join us in the back for food. Thank you all.
I want to, as you express your appreciation, Shareen, I'd like to express my appreciation. In the academy, we often think of teaching, research, and service as three different boxes. And if you're really good in one, you don't have to do anything with the other two. In truth, the best analogy is it's a rope, and it has three strands of teaching, research, and service. And the best of us are the people who can excel in all three. Shareen's given us a wonderful model of that ability. So again, thank you. Thank you all for being here. You're always welcome at the Gladstein Family Human Rights Institute. We do our work because of you. We do our work for you. So please always feel you have a home here in our programs and at the Institute. Please enjoy the reception out back. And again, Shareen, thank you.
Thank you.